The Access Vector, Case 12, Volume 2, The Synthesis Case. Filed from Treaty 4 Territory, Oskana ka Asasteki, Regina. The volume so far has shown us several patterns. Cases 5 and 6. The state extending coercive capacity ahead of any public account of its use. Cases 7 through 9. Cabinet figures whose external sector credentials laundered institutional conduct. Cases 10 and 11. Crown corporations hollowing out into permanent vendor annuities. Each face of one operation, connected by a small set of access brokerage firms whose function is to convert former public office credentials into vendor-side market entry and whose role itself is unregulated. One door, many tenants. The case follows one broker, Strategy Corp, the Toronto-based public affairs firm. One career, David McNaughton's 5-stage transit from Ontario Premier's Principal Secretary to current strategic advisor at CIBC. And 3 of the operations the network has enabled. Palantir Canada, Therm Group at Ontario Place, Harper & Associates Saskatchewan contract. 3 different files, 3 different doors. One brokerage network, cross-jurisdictional, cross-partisan. The credential transits at speeds the regulators tracking it cannot match. The structural argument is that the patterns are not coincidence. They are produced by an institutional layer that is unregulated relative to its consequences. Section 1. The career in one paragraph. David McNaughton served as Principal Secretary to the Premier of Ontario, Dalton McGuinty, from 2003 to 2005. From 2005 to 2016, he was Chairman of Strategy Corp, a Toronto-based public affairs and government relations firm representing corporate clients before federal, provincial, and municipal Canadian decision-makers. In March 2016, Justin Trudeau's incoming Liberal government appointed him Canada's ambassador to the United States, where he served through August 2019, leading much of the Canadian side of the NAFTA renegotiation. Then the transit to the vendor side. In September 2019, within 4 weeks of leaving the ambassadorship, he was named President of Palantir Canada, the Canadian subsidiary of the Silicon Valley Defense and Intelligence Analytics firm. He held that role through 2025. He is currently a strategic advisor in the office of the CEO at CIBC. 5 stages. Provincial Office, 2003 to 05. Broker Firm Chair, 2005 to 16. Diplomatic Post, 2016 to 19. Vendor Presidency, 2019 to 25. Bank Advisory, current. And the regulator findings. In 2020, the Federal Conflict of Interest and Ethics Commissioner found that McNaughton had violated the Conflict of Interest Act by offering Palantir's services pro bono to senior federal officials during the COVID-19 response, within the 5-year cooling-off period following his ambassadorship. A parallel investigation by the Office of the Commissioner of Lobbying concluded he had not contravened the Lobbying Act on the same conduct. One commissioner found violation, the other did not. And the conduct itself. In either reading, a person with a recently held diplomatic credential carrying that credential into a private vendor sales conversation with the government he had recently represented. That career is the case in miniature. The provincial office credential becomes the access broker credential, becomes the ambassadorial credential, becomes the vendor-side credential, becomes the bank advisory credential. Each role transfers the next role's value. The credential moves faster than the regulators tracking it. The transfer is what the broker firm exists to facilitate. Section 2. The firm. Strategy Corp is one of the most established public affairs firms in Canada. Its senior figures are drawn from both Liberal and Conservative federal and Ontario provincial networks. It is, on its own description, a consultancy advising corporate clients on how to navigate Canadian government decision-making. Accurate and incomplete. The function the firm actually performs, and that this case observes, is the brokerage of access between corporate clients and the institutional decision points that govern public assets, regulatory approvals, procurement contracts, and licensure regimes. The firm is the door, and its senior figures are the credentials that open it. The credentials are produced by whom? In the federal and provincial public office system, and then carried into the firm at the end of each principal's public career. The firm's clients pay for the credentials' continued application to the institutional rooms it once occupied. This is not hidden. It is the firm's business model, conducted openly, and it is mostly legal. The Lobbying Act requires registration of paid lobbyists. The Conflict of Interest Act imposes a 5-year restriction on the most senior public office holders engaging in lobbying activity. The Office of the Commissioner of Lobbying maintains a public registry. Within those constraints, the conversion of public office credential into private broker fee is a permitted activity in Canada. And the case observation. Not the legality of the activity, but its consequence. A stable institutional layer between Canadian public decision-making and the corporate interests seeking to shape it, populated by figures whose credentials were generated at the public's expense and are now deployed in service of clients whose interests do not necessarily align with the public's. The credential continues. The accountability does not. The layer is not subject to the same accountability mechanisms as the offices its figures used to hold. Section 3. 3 doors, 1 network. 3 operations examined in this volume share access through this layer. Door A. Palantir, Canada. The Silicon Valley vendor. The Canadian arm of the Palo Alto-based defense and intelligence platform whose products are used by U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement for deportation, by the Israeli military in Gaza operations, and by U.S. police departments for predictive policing. A $14.4 million Department of National Defense agreement signed March 2020, undisclosed at the time, surfacing only in 2025 through a parliamentary question. A $3.7 million D&D contract in 2024, providing access to Canadian military data, including potential civilian social media monitoring. A $36.6 million Ontario Provincial Police contract awarded October 2023. Calgary Police use since 2013. The Canadian President from September 2019 to 2025. McNaughton. Door B. Therme Group, Canada. The Vienna Spa operator. Won the 95-year lease to redevelop Ontario Place, the publicly owned Toronto waterfront site, announced July 30, 2021. The Ontario Auditor General's 2024 Value for Money report identified substantial public costs to the province for site preparation and underground parking subsidizing the private development. Therme Canada's access into the Toronto and Ontario establishment was brokered, according to the Trillium's 3-part 2024 investigation by Leslie Noble, an icon in conservative politics in Ontario and a senior figure in the Strategy Corp network. Noble introduced Therme to the Toronto International Film Festival in 2018 while she sat on TIFF's board. Door C. Harper and Associates. The global affairs consultancy chaired and led by former Prime Minister Stephen Harper, contracted by the government of Saskatchewan since November 14, 2019, for international trade advisory services. $240,000 annually, cumulative billing of $840,000 by May 2024, per the Saskatchewan NDP. The contract extended in November 2024. The description of work sections redacted in the FOI responses. Premier Moe, announcing the arrangement, compared it to the province's then-existing relationship with the U.S. law firm Nelson Mullins, headed by former U.S. Ambassador David Wilkins. The model is named. 3 doors, 1 network, 3 different files, 3 different credential vectors, 1 brokerage network, the Canadian Public Affairs and Government Relations layer, in which Strategy Corp is a prominent firm but not the only one. The figures who staff this layer are not interchangeable. The structure they collectively occupy is.
Section 4. What the layer enables.
Read the 3 operations together and the function of the access layer becomes visible. Palantir.
Government and defense-centric by its own business model.
It needs procurement decisions to land in its direction. It needs ministers and senior officials to be comfortable with its presence in sensitive data environments. It needs the public account of its products, intelligence-led policing, defense data integration, to be received as administrative rather than as political. A vendor with this profile entering the Canadian market without a credential at its Canadian presidency level would face slower adoption, more public scrutiny, and a regulatory and political environment less inclined to grant the trust the product requires.
And with a former ambassador as president.
On every one of those vectors, less friction. The credential's continued application is the asset. The friction it reduces is the laundering.
Therm.
The model in its provincial asset form. A foreign wellness operator with no Canadian operating history granted a 95-year lease on publicly owned waterfront with substantial public subsidies. Without a credential at its access and introductions level, it would face longer regulatory timelines, more aggressive public interest scrutiny, and a political environment less prepared to grant the lease terms. Rooted into the Toronto establishment by a senior conservative public affairs figure with TIFF partnership and curated civic introductions, less friction at each of those points.
And Harper and Associates.
The cleanest version because the most explicit. The province is not paying for the advice. International trade advisory services are widely available, including from career professionals who do not require $240,000 per year retainers. The province is paying for the credential's continued application. Harper's relationships, his standing with foreign trade ministries, the diplomatic and political pedigree his name brings to a meeting. That is the only product on offer that justifies the price.
And the province has stated as much.
When the Premier compared the relationship explicitly to the Wilkins-Nelson Mullins arrangement, the redacted description of work sections in the FOI returns are the legal architecture confirming the model. The public pays, in unbroken continuity, for the post-cabinet application of the credential the public paid to produce in office.
Section 5. Where this case meets the volume.
Each preceding case documents a different face of the same operation. Cases 5 and 6, the state extending coercive capacity.
Borrowed compassion.
Case 5 observed the conversion of Saskatchewan's regulatory void, failure to license private addiction treatment facilities, into authorized involuntary detention under the Compassionate Intervention Act. The downstream consequence? A publicly funded captive patient market for private operators in a sector the province has deliberately not regulated. The access network described here is the architecture by which such operators secure their provincial contracts.
The provincial force.
Case 6 observed the standing up of the Saskatchewan Marshals Service, intelligence-led, warrant-driven, province-wide, under a single minister, also holding justice, attorney general, corrections, public safety, and the firearms secretariat. The data integration layer such a force would require is precisely the product Palantir's platforms offer.
Cases 7 through 9.
The credentialed personnel sequence. Cabinet figures whose external sector credentials laundered the institutional conduct of the governments they served. Case 9 in particular named the deferred acknowledgement pattern by which the figure's later honesty arrives only after the institutional cost has been paid. The McNaughton career arc, provincial principal secretary, public affairs chair, ambassador, vendor-side president, bank advisor, is the same pattern viewed from a different stage of the same biography.
Cases 10 and 11.
The demand-side condition. Saskatchewan Crown corporations and provincial institutions that have spent 2 decades hollowing out their internal technical and senior professional capability, generating a permanent need for the external vendors and advisors the access network supplies. The hollowing out and the supplying are one operation seen from 2 sides.
And Case 12 itself.
The connective tissue. The architecture by which the products of Cases 5 and 6 are supplied to the broker network's clients, by which the credentials produced by Cases 7 through 9 are deployed after office, by which the capability voids of Cases 10 and 11 are filled by vendors. The volume reads, finally, as one argument.
Section 6. Why this is laundering.
The activity examined here is not, in the main, illegal. The Lobbying Act permits the work. The Conflict of Interest Act imposes cooling-off periods that are sometimes observed and sometimes, as the 2020 finding against McNaughton documents, not. The firms operate openly. The contracts are, in the legal sense, valid. The vendors deliver products that in some applications do useful work.
Then where is the laundering?
In the misdescription. Each transaction is publicly accounted for in terms its surface description carries. A procurement decision, Palantir's federal contracts. A redevelopment partnership, Thermes Ontario Place lease. A trade advisory engagement, Harper & Associates Saskatchewan retainer. Each surface description on its own is plausible. A government needs analytics software. A province wants its waterfront redeveloped. An export-dependent jurisdiction can use a former prime minister's relationships.
And the aggregation
Is what the surface descriptions do not name. Read together, the 3 transactions are not 3 independent administrative decisions, but 3 applications of a single architecture in which former public office credentials are continuously deployed by a small network of firms to broker public asset transfers, procurement decisions, and licensure outcomes in favor of corporate clients whose interests are not the public's.
The transactions launder each other.
Palantir's federal credibility makes Thermes' provincial credibility easier to establish because the same access layer routes both. Harper's Saskatchewan contract normalizes Wilkins' Saskatchewan by way of Nelson Mullins arrangement because the public account of each treats the other as evidence that this is simply how international trade works. The Office of the Commissioner of Lobbying clearing McNaughton under one statute, while the Ethics Commissioner found violation under another, normalizes the pattern by establishing that the conduct is at most a marginal regulatory question rather than a substantive structural one. Each cleared transaction makes the next one easier to clear.
And the cost
Falls on the constituencies who have no broker. The small Saskatchewan business, hit with a Compassionate Intervention Act, a requirement to pay, a vendor-locked Crown Corp IT system, or an Ontario Place neighbourhood newly reorganized around a private spa, is not represented at the access layer. The constituencies that built the value of the credentials being deployed against their interests do not get a refund. The brokers are paid in both directions, by the corporate clients for the access, and indirectly by the public through the elevated taxpayer cost of the resulting transactions.
Section 7. What the case does not claim.
It does not claim that Strategy Corp, Harper & Associates, or any other public affairs firm is operating illegally. The 2020 conflict of interest finding against McNaughton is a single named instance and is sourced to the Ethics Commissioner's own report. No other claim of illegality is made about any individual or firm in this case.
And it names other firms by way of completeness.
It does not claim that Palantir, Therm, or Harper & Associates were the broker network's only clients, or that the broker network is the only access vector by which corporate interests engage Canadian government decision-making. The three named operations are illustrative anchor instances. The broader market includes other firms, Earnscliffe, Crestview, Hill and Knowlton, Crestone, Council Public Affairs, Compass Rose, and others.
Nor of every former official.
It does not claim that every former public office holder who enters the public affairs sector is engaged in laundering. The structural argument is about the aggregate function of the layer, not about the conduct of any one figure. Many former officials enter the sector and conduct themselves within legal and ethical norms. The question is about the layer's collective effect on Canadian public decision-making, not about the morality of individual participants.
And no Palantir Therm corporate link.
It does not claim that a direct corporate ownership link between Palantir and Therm has been established. The Trillium's investigation into Therm's financing did not surface such a link, and neither did this case's independent verification. The link is access brokerage, not ownership.
What it does claim.
The Volume 2 patterns are not coincidence. They are produced by an institutional layer that is unregulated relative to its consequences, that operates openly within laws that permit most of what it does, and that connects vendor-side and corporate client interests to Canadian public decision-making through credentials produced at public expense. The McNaughton career arc is one arc through that layer. The arc is legal. The function is laundering. Both can be true.
The strongest version.
Refuses to indict individuals, refuses to dismiss legitimate vendor work, refuses to soften the institutional indictment.
Read together with the rest of the volume.
The cases are not a series of complaints about Canadian government conduct. They are a description of how Canadian government conduct is, in the present period, organized. The case observes the structure. The reader assesses what should be done about it.
End transmission.
Filed from Regina. No sponsors, no trackers, open for correction.